In most jobs, the day begins in a fairly predictable way, a fixed starting time, a marked break, and an end that rarely changes. That structure allows life to be organized with a certain stability, as if time were divided into pieces that always fit the same way, but there are jobs where that logic does not exist. Heavy transport is one of them, where the idea of a fixed schedule simply does not fit the reality of daily work. A truck driver may start their day early in the morning or in the middle of the night without that responding to a stable routine. They may stop for hours due to a load, a delay, or road conditions, and resume later under completely different circumstances. Even the end of the day is variable, as it can be moved forward or extended without that necessarily meaning a failure in planning. From the outside, this constant variation can easily be interpreted as disorder or lack of structure, as if the work depended on improvisation without a real system supporting it in the background. But that is only the surface of what actually happens. Because even though there is no fixed schedule in the traditional sense, the work is fully structured. It is just not organized around the clock, but around factors that constantly change, such as routes, traffic, loading times, mandatory breaks, and coordination with other points in the logistics chain. The fundamental difference lies in how time is understood within this system. Instead of dividing it into rigid, equal blocks, transport works like a chain where each decision directly affects the next. A delay at one point can alter the entire route, just as an advantage can completely reorganize the planning. In that context, a fixed schedule ceases to be a useful tool because reality does not behave in a stable or predictable way. This causes each day to be different, even when tasks appear to repeat under the same general scheme. That variability is precisely what generates confusion from the outside, because what seems like improvisation actually follows an adaptive organizational model designed to adjust to conditions that are never exactly the same. If the system operates without fixed schedules, the question is no longer when work is done, but what kind of structure allows all of this to function without ever breaking. Confusion arises because this type of work is usually observed through the same parameters applied to any other work environment. From that perspective, if there is no fixed start time or clear moment of completion, it seems logical to assume that there is no defined structure, but that reading only works when order is understood exclusively through the clock. In heavy transport, the logic is different, since order does not depend on a fixed sequence of schedules, but on a system that continuously adjusts to what is happening at each moment. It is not daily repetition that maintains stability, but the process's ability to reorganize without stopping when conditions change. The problem is that this type of system does not respond well to the logic of a traditional workday. In an environment where variables are stable, schedules work because conditions hardly change. But here, each stage of the process depends on factors that cannot be fixed with absolute precision, giving rise to a model that is not understood through the rigidity of time, but through a constant capacity for adaptation that manifests in every part of the system. This adaptation does not function as disorder, but as a form of organization more precise than it seems. Each element within the chain has a defined role, even though its execution timing may vary. When one part is delayed or moved forward, the others do not stop and adjust their functioning accordingly, maintaining the overall movement of the system. The key lies in understanding that control does not disappear when rigidity is lost. In fact, it is still present, but in a different form, because instead of relying on fixed schedules, the system depends on the ability to react to changes. That ability is what allows transport to keep functioning even when conditions are not ideal. When observing how a small change at one point can affect everything else, it becomes clearer why rigid schedules are not a viable solution. A delay in a load, a variation in traffic, or any unforeseen event can alter the entire sequence of times. In a rigid system, that would generate a collapse, but in a flexible one, it generates an adjustment. That difference is what defines the way transport is organized, since the goal is not to avoid change, because that is impossible, but rather to respond to it as efficiently as possible. For this reason, instead of setting schedules that are unlikely to be met, the system is built on margins, time windows, and decisions made according to what is happening at each moment. As this logic becomes visible in practice, the idea of disorder begins to lose force, because what appears chaotic from the outside actually responds to a system that operates under different rules. In that context, precision is no longer measured in exact minutes, but depends on the ability to maintain the flow without major interruptions, revealing a form of organization that is not immediately apparent but is essential for keeping everything moving. And when it is understood that there is a real structure behind this apparent lack of schedules, a question arises that shifts the focus again. If the truck driver does not work according to a fixed schedule, and if the system does not depend on rigid clocks, then someone must be defining these times in another way. So, who really decides when each part of the work in transport starts and ends? When looking for a direct answer, the idea that someone clearly and deliberately sets the times seems logical. But in the heavy transport industry, that figure does not exist as such, since there is no single person deciding when each workday begins and ends. Instead, the times emerge as the result of multiple decisions made at different points in the same chain. Within that same framework, the truck driver is part of the system but does not control it entirely. Their job is to execute a part of the process in an environment where many variables are already in motion before they intervene. This means that, although they can make decisions on the route, the start and end of their day are conditioned by factors defined outside the cab. In practice, this conditioning is expressed at the loading and unloading points, which function as nodes where much of that external dependency is concentrated. Each of them operates with its own times, its own availability, and an internal organization that is not always visible. Logistics centers, warehouses, and clients establish operational windows that determine when a truck can be serviced. These windows do not always align with each other, and that is where the complexity begins to take shape. Added to this are the logistics operators who coordinate movements between different points. Their role is to organize transport flows so that everything fits, but that fit is neither perfect nor fixed. Every decision made at this level directly affects the truck driver, who must adapt to the assigned times and to the conditions generated at each stage of the route. The concept of loading and unloading windows is key to understanding how the times are formed. It is not about rigid schedules in which everything happens at an exact hour, but about ranges in which the truck can be serviced. Within those margins, advances, delays, or waits can occur that completely alter the initial planning. Time, in this context, is not a fixed line. It is a space that continuously adjusts. From there, the dependency between processes becomes evident in daily operations. When a load is delayed, that misalignment drags the next point, which is also affected in its planning. And if the opposite happens, that is, if a truck arrives earlier than expected, the system does not accelerate, but instead requires a wait until availability exists. In all cases, each link depends on the previous one, and that interdependence prevents times from remaining stable consistently. Therefore, as all these pieces interact, we see that time ceases to be something imposed from a single point and becomes something constructed in motion. It is not a fixed order, it is the result of how situations are resolved throughout the process. The truck driver participates in that construction but does not fully direct it, since their scope of action lies within a system that is already in operation. This explains why individual control has clear limits. The driver can optimize their driving, manage their brakes, and adapt to route conditions, but cannot alter the overall structure that defines when and where they must be. That structure is the result of many simultaneous decisions, not of a single closed plan. When it is understood that times are not imposed but emerge from the interaction among multiple actors, the absence of a fixed schedule ceases to seem like a problem. It becomes a logical consequence of a system that requires flexibility to function, but that flexibility also implies an inevitable condition. If times are constructed in this way, they cannot be stable or predictable in all cases. And this is where the real question arises, because if each decision is part of a chain in motion and any variation can alter what comes next, then the question is not the origin of schedules, but something much more fundamental. What truly disrupts the stability of those times in the daily practice of transport? When times are constructed from multiple decisions and depend on a whole moving chain, stability ceases to be a real option. Not because the system fails, but because it is exposed to factors that constantly change. That variability does not appear at a single point, but at several simultaneously. And it is precisely that accumulation that makes it impossible to maintain a fixed schedule like in other jobs. Among these factors, traffic is one of the most visible, but also one of the most unpredictable, because it does not behave the same way throughout the day, nor always follows the same patterns. A route that is smooth at one moment can suddenly become slow, and that difference, although it may seem minor, translates into minutes or even hours that disrupt the entire plan. Added to this are weather conditions, which introduce another level of uncertainty. Rain, wind, or fog not only affect speed, but also change the way driving is conducted, because suddenly priority becomes safety, and that implies adjusting the pace, changing decisions, and in many cases, accepting that the estimated time is no longer valid. This is not an exception. It is a constant variable that is part of the work. Within that same set of factors, loading and unloading times are in many cases even more decisive than what happens on the route. Each facility has its own rhythm, its own organization, and its own limitations. A truck may arrive within its expected window and still have to wait because the internal operation does not always align with the exact arrival. That wait is not always predictable, and when it is extended, it affects everything that comes afterward. Infrastructure also influences how times develop. Limited access, tight spaces, or inefficient internal processes can generate delays that do not directly depend on the driver. Each point in the chain has its own conditions, and those conditions are not always designed to maintain constant flow. Added to this are operational contingencies which are impossible to anticipate completely. A mechanical issue, a route change, or an unexpected situation with the load can alter the course of the journey at any moment. They are not the norm, but neither are they rare, as they form part of the reality of transport and force decisions to be adjusted on the fly. And it is precisely when these factors begin to coincide that their true impact becomes clear. A small traffic delay, combined with a weight at the load and an adverse weather condition, can create a much greater deviation than each element would produce on its own. That cumulative effect is what ultimately breaks any attempt to maintain a rigid schedule. In this framework, absolute precision ceases to be a realistic goal because it is impossible to work with exact hours when conditions are constantly changing. Instead, what exists are estimates, margins, and a continuous capacity for adaptation that activates according to what is happening at each moment. Because the system does not attempt to eliminate variability, since that is impossible, it assumes its presence and organizes itself to continue functioning despite it. This reality presents an obvious need. If times cannot be fixed precisely and changes are inevitable, then there must be some type of control to prevent that flexibility from becoming a problem. Because without limits, constant adaptation could lead to excess, fatigue, or unnecessary risks. And this is precisely where the next layer of the system appears, because although fixed schedules do not exist, that does not mean that everything is allowed. What truly defines balance is not when work occurs, but how much can be done within that changing environment. Therefore, what rules impose order in a system where times never stop moving? When everything seems to move without a fixed pattern, the need to establish limits becomes inevitable. Not to impose a rigid structure, but to prevent that flexibility from generating risks. Heavy transport does not function without control, and that control is not based on exact schedules, but on rules that define how far each workday can go. The first element that introduces that control is the driving hours limit. A truck driver cannot drive indefinitely, no matter how favorable the conditions or how much pressure exists to meet a certain time. There are clear margins that establish how much can be driven within a period, and once reached, the only option is to stop. These breaks are not arbitrary. They respond to the need to reduce fatigue and maintain an adequate level of attention, because in an environment where conditions constantly change, reaction capacity is key, and that capacity depends largely on rest. The day cannot extend without limit, and the accumulation of hours has a cutoff point that forces real energy recovery. That rest not only affects when the truck stops, but conditions everything that comes afterward. Once that period begins, time is outside the operation, and planning must adapt to that pause. Here, a fundamental difference with traditional jobs appears. There is no fixed hour to start or finish, but there is a clear limit on how much can be worked. Control is not exercised over the clock itself, but over the duration of the activity, thus allowing the system to maintain its flexibility without losing sight of safety and the driver's operational capacity. For these rules to work, constant monitoring is necessary. Driving time, breaks, and rest periods are recorded, which allows verification that the established limits are being met. This record is not only a tool for external control, but also a reference for the driver themselves, who must manage their day within those margins. This balance between flexibility and restriction is what keeps the system running. On one hand, it allows adaptation to the inevitable changes that arise on the route and in logistics. On the other, it sets limits that prevent that adaptation from becoming an excessive burden. It is not about eliminating variability, but containing it within a safe framework. As these rules become integrated into daily operations, the absence of a fixed schedule ceases to be a problem and becomes a condition to manage. The truck driver does not work without limits. They work within a system where time is regulated differently, and it is precisely this different form of regulation that defines how the workday is organized. At this point, once clear limits exist but no defined schedules, an operational need emerges that conditions everything else. Work cannot depend solely on what the regulations dictate, but requires constant decisions to fit within that framework. When the system defines how much can be worked, but does not specify exactly when, organization ceases to be a structure imposed from outside and becomes the driver's direct responsibility. It is not about following a fixed schedule, but about constructing a workday that fits within the existing limits while still achieving the transport objectives. The first reference point is not the clock, but the delivery. Everything revolves around arriving within a designated window, not at an exact hour. That completely changes planning, because time is no longer divided into equal blocks, but organized according to a result. From there, planning becomes flexible by necessity, since work is done not with certainties, but with estimates that are constantly adjusted. Before starting a route, there may be an approximate idea of how the day will unfold, but that idea is not definitive. As variables arise, that planning is modified without it being an error, but rather a logical adaptation to what is happening. And it is precisely at that point that real-time decision-making becomes an essential part of the job. Knowing when to move, when to stop, and how to adjust the pace no longer depends on a preset schedule, but is conditioned by the ability to interpret the context. Traffic, weather, waiting times, and environmental conditions force the choice at each moment of the best possible option within the available limits. At that same level of constant decision-making, rest management also takes on a strategic role. It is not only about fulfilling a mandatory break, but about integrating that moment into the progression of the route so that its impact is minimized. Choosing where and when to stop can make a significant difference in how the rest of the day is organized. Over time, this way of working gives rise to a routine that is not rigid, but neither is it chaotic. Patterns repeat, decisions become more natural, and ways of acting consolidate with experience. The difference is that this routine is not defined by fixed schedules, but by an adaptable logic that allows responses to different situations without losing control. This form of organization allows transport to function without relying on a rigid structure, but it also introduces a reality that is not always perceived from the outside. Living and working under these conditions implies constantly adjusting habits and maintaining a rhythm that does not follow traditional patterns. And when that adjustment becomes permanent, what changes is not only the organization of work, but the way of living day to day. The first change appears in something as basic as rest. Sleep does not always occur at the same hour or under the same conditions. The body loses a stable reference and begins to adjust to the pauses available, to the moments when work allows it, rather than when the clock dictates. This variability is not occasional, it is part of daily functioning, and over time it demands a physical adaptability that not all jobs require. From there, routine ceases to be predictable. There is no fixed sequence that repeats the same way each day. One day may start early and end sooner than expected, while another may extend far beyond what was planned. That lack of regularity does not imply disorder, but it does change the way habits are formed. Maintaining consistency in this context does not depend on repeating schedules, but on sustaining certain patterns within a changing environment. That difference becomes even more evident when compared to life outside the truck. Most people organize their time according to shared schedules, which allows coordination of activities, meetings, and routines. In contrast, when work does not follow that structure, synchronizing with others becomes more complex. It is not always possible to coincide, not always possible to plan precisely, and that creates a distance that is not physical but temporal. In this scenario, mental adaptation becomes as important as physical adaptation. Working without fixed schedules means living with uncertainty, making constant decisions, and accepting that not everything can be anticipated. That demand does not disappear with experience, but it transforms because over time it ceases to be perceived as a difficulty and becomes a developed skill, a way of managing the environment without losing stability. That capacity for adaptation is, in fact, a form of control. It is not the rigid control of a fixed schedule, but a control based on flexibility. Knowing how to adjust without losing direction, reorganizing the day without disorder, and maintaining performance under changing conditions is what allows the system to function. And it is precisely for that reason that, in the end, what defines this work is not the absence of structure, but the presence of a different structure. One that does not rely on the exact repetition of each day, but on the ability to adapt without losing control, to sustain a rhythm without depending on a fixed schedule, and to turn variability into a normal part of functioning. There is an important difference between looking at a system and understanding it. For a long time, the absence of fixed schedules may seem like a failure, a lack of order, or a type of work difficult to justify. But when everything behind it is observed, that idea loses meaning and gives way to a much broader understanding. Time in this context is not a structure imposed, but a variable that is managed. It is not about fitting reality into a schedule, but about adapting each decision to an environment that is constantly changing. And in that process, what seemed like disorganization reveals itself as a different form of control, more flexible, but also more demanding. This way of working is not exclusive to a small group, it is part of a system that supports much more than is visible at first glance. Every route, every delivery, and every adjustment along the way is part of a network that maintains constant movement. When that is understood, the perspective changes. It is no longer about why there are no fixed schedules, but about why they could not exist without disrupting the system's balance. Flexibility ceases to be an exception and becomes the only way to keep everything running without stopping. And if you've made it this far, you are probably no longer seeing this work the same way. That shift in perspective is exactly what this type of content builds. If you are interested in further exploring what is usually left unexplained, subscribing is the way to not miss upcoming analyses, and a like helps this type of content reach more people who also want to understand what lies behind each journey. Because this is not just about transport. It is about invisible structures in continuous operation, about decisions that sustain entire systems without being seen, and about the silent machines that keep the world moving.